Hello everyone. I'm glad to sit down today and have a deep conversation about something extremely important that is happening right now, yet is being severely overlooked. It is now April 2026. If you turn on the TV or scroll through the news, you'll find the world's attention is naturally focused on global geopolitical upheavals. While these are indeed heart-wrenching events, they have created a fatal blind spot. Public attention is far from sufficient regarding a major systemic issue quietly emerging on Wall Street. In fact, in those financial towers, the situation has become so dire that even a former CEO of Goldman Sachs issued an extremely stern warning. He admitted to smelling a new crisis in the air, one that is highly likely to be extremely similar to the 2008 financial tsunami that swept the globe. This isn't just a game of numbers on the balance sheets of Wall Street's wealthy. Once this lurking new crisis erupts, it could directly affect many ordinary people. It could severely impact the livelihoods of many and the retirement funds everyone relies on. So, what exactly is happening behind the closed doors of Wall Street? To put it simply, an extremely serious crisis is erupting in the private credit market. To give you a concrete idea, we must first understand the scale of this market. It is already a massive industry worth as much as $3 trillion. You might ask, how did such a large market emerge so suddenly? In fact, since the 2008 financial crisis, the private credit industry has shown exponential, frantic growth. The reason is simple. After the last housing market crash, regulators imposed extremely strict limitations on traditional Wall Street banks to prevent a repeat of the tragedy. Traditional banks could no longer freely lend money to high-risk companies. However, the market's thirst for capital did not disappear. Consequently, more and more other types of financial firms stepped in to take over this business, issuing loans and high-risk venture loans to private companies. These are collectively known in the financial world as private credit. The fatal flaw here is that these financial firms are subject to much less regulation. Critical information is simply not disclosed to the public. This is a highly opaque shadow banking system. Yet, despite being non-transparent, it has attracted countless investors scrambling to buy into these private credit funds. In a sluggish market, they were deeply attracted and even blinded by the extremely high double-digit returns offered here. Ultimately, the truth cannot be hidden forever. Moving into late 2025 and early 2026, those concealed cracks finally began to collapse. A series of major bankruptcies involving private credit occurred. In response, Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Chase, issued a very famous warning. He used a vivid yet bone-chilling metaphor. When you see one cockroach, there are likely others hiding in the dark. This was his hint that the bankruptcies we are seeing are likely just the beginning of a larger, more destructive systemic crisis. The market is extremely sensitive, and Dimon's warning was not without merit. This is why, in the first 3 months of 2026, we witnessed a precipitous collapse in stock prices. To give you a specific example, a financial firm named Blue Owl saw its stock price plummet by 40% in the first 3 months of 2026 alone. This is absolutely not normal market volatility. It is capital fleeing on a massive scale. If you think this crisis will only spread among smaller, lesser-known alternative investment firms, you are gravely mistaken. This crisis has spread like a virus to some of the largest asset management companies on Earth, such as the well-known financial giant BlackRock. How tense has this situation become? BlackRock, along with many other Wall Street titans, has actually been forced to take extreme measures, restricting investors from withdrawing money. Why is even a behemoth like BlackRock unable to provide the cash? This goes back to the operating model of private credit. When investors initially used their hard-earned money to buy into these private credit funds, fund managers immediately lent that money to high-risk, high-leverage companies. Therefore, when market sentiment shifts and panicked investors want to withdraw their capital, BlackRock's vaults do not have cash waiting for them. They simply cannot immediately meet the withdrawal demands. Friends, this is essentially very similar to the terrifying bank run phenomenon in traditional banking. Private credit investors are extremely panicked. Everyone is crowding the doors, shouting to get all their money back. This directly leads many financial firms to desperately try to sell off their held assets in the market to raise cash. But the most critical problem is that many assets in the private credit market lack liquidity. They are loans locked in long-term contracts. This artificially creates a terrifying death spiral and feedback loop. When BlackRock and other major Wall Street firms restrict withdrawals for self-preservation, the investors outside only become more panicked. They will say angrily and desperately, "Where is my money? I want my money now." And this panic further accelerates the market collapse. Hearing this, you might feel that as long as your money is in traditional large Wall Street banks and you don't touch private credit, you are safe. Unfortunately, the blood vessels of the financial system are interconnected. There is a very real and imminent risk that this panic contagion could rapidly spread. The large Wall Street banks you thought were safe are actually deeply mired in the risks of these bad loans. According to the latest estimates from Moody's, the U.S. banking industry faces nearly $300 billion in exposure to private credit loans. How is this possible? Didn't we just say that banks were strictly regulated after 2008? Yes, although these Wall Street banks were more strictly regulated after the 2008 financial crisis and forced to stop lending so much money directly to high-risk companies, Wall Street never lacks people who find loopholes. These large banks took a detour. They began lending massive amounts of capital to unregulated private credit firms, which then turned around and issued high-risk loans to other underlying companies. You see, the capital still flowed to high-risk areas just through an extra layer of white gloves. Consequently, if those bottom-layer companies begin to default on private credit loans, which, as we discussed, we are already seeing happen in reality, then the high and mighty traditional large banks will still be strongly affected, because as many private credit firms begin to fail and head toward bankruptcy, it means they will completely lose the ability to repay the initial loans from the large Wall Street banks. The final bad debts will still explode on the balance sheets of traditional banks. This sense of an impending storm is not just ordinary people worrying about nothing. The top titans of Wall Street have already begun to prepare for the worst. Former Goldman Sachs CEO Lloyd Blankfein, in a recent interview with Bloomberg, warned very seriously that he can smell the scent of another financial crisis on the horizon. We need to listen to this clip of Blankfein very carefully. Remember, he is no outsider. He was the head of the Goldman Sachs Group during the earth-shattering financial catastrophe of 2008. He is someone who has truly seen great storms. In the interview, he profoundly pointed out that, to some extent, the reason serious problems and crashes occur in financial markets is often simply because a lack of discipline accumulates over time. He believes this is a human weakness, and therefore the eruption of a financial crisis has a certain inevitability that cannot be escaped. He admitted that while he cannot precisely predict whether we are already at the absolute end of this economic cycle, it is undeniable that we are rapidly approaching the later stages, and the entire market is long overdue for some kind of thorough reckoning. He also specifically emphasized that normally he is very, very cautious, as he has worked in the risk management industry his whole life. But even so, at this moment, he feels particularly cautious, or even worried. You can use various complex economic models to point out several reasons for an impending collapse, but he believes that even if there were no other reasons, the mere fact that we have enjoyed a long period of peace and haven't had a major problem for a long time is enough to be wary. He asserted without a doubt that during the past period of prosperity, the market absolutely misallocated massive amounts of money to places that are ultimately destined to be written off and lost entirely. He particularly reminded everyone that when you deal with assets like credit that are extremely opaque and have very poor liquidity, that is obviously the primary disaster zone. You must keep your eyes wide open to look for hidden dangers. When the market has reached the edge of a cliff and the Wall Street alarms have sounded, you might expect the government to step in to protect the people. But chillingly, something even worse has happened. As this Wall Street crisis continues to expand and financial analysts desperately warn of a possible new major crisis, do you know what the current White House's response has been? Instead of trying to defuse the bomb, the Donald Trump administration has been blatantly supporting this teetering private credit industry. Just in August 2025, the Trump-led White House high-profilely announced a new executive order with an extremely cynical-sounding title: Democratizing Alternative Asset Access for 401k Investors. Let's tear off this hypocritical packaging and see what it actually means. It means that Trump has been under intense lobbying from some of Wall Street's main political supporters and donors. These Wall Street tycoons have only one fundamental goal in lobbying the White House. They desperately need to find a new group of investors to take over these failing, terrible investments in private credit. Because many of Wall Street's more astute and mature institutional investors have already foreseen that a historic crisis is brewing in the private credit sector. Therefore, many of these smart investors are desperately trying to find less sophisticated retail investors, ordinary people like you and me, and unsuspecting massive pension funds to dupe them into investing in private credit. Once these ordinary people take over, these Wall Street titans can take the opportunity to sell their positions at a high price, successfully cash out, and perfectly transfer these bad debts that are destined for default to less mature investors. In other words, the White House is using the power of the state machinery to help Wall Street let ordinary people and the retirement funds they have spent their lives saving bear these massive bad debts that are about to completely implode. This is the core and most sinister point of this so-called democratization executive order. It is framed as helping ordinary people achieve high returns by democratizing the entry thresholds for private credit and private equity, when in fact the truth is exactly the opposite. It is entirely for the benefit of Wall Street oligarchs, ruthlessly herding and harvesting the wealth of ordinary working people. However, when you calm down and consider that Donald Trump himself is a thoroughbred billionaire, the issuance of such an extremely cynical policy is actually not surprising at all. The government team he established is surrounded by a full dozen billionaires. An even more direct transfer of interests lies in the fact that if you check the funding sources for Donald Trump's 2024 presidential campaign, you will find one of his largest donors is currently the highest-paid executive on Wall Street's, Ben Schwartzman. This Schwartzman is none other than the CEO of the famous Blackstone Group. What level of existence is Blackstone? It is currently the world's largest alternative asset management company, which not only has a massive private equity division, but also faces extremely large risk exposure in private credit. This deep binding of interests and risk exposure directly explains why Blackstone's stock price would suffer a tragic 30% decline in the first 3 months of 2026. So, when you connect these clues, you find that everything makes sense. Trump's wealthy friends and top donors on Wall Street saw their wealth shrinking and felt extreme panic. So they immediately picked up the phone and asked the White House to use executive power to provide emergency help in finding bag holders. But unfortunately, this is far from the whole story. Just as the formation of a superstorm often requires the collision of multiple air currents, there are currently more layered systemic problems converging, which are highly likely to lead to an unprecedented perfect storm. Among these, the AI artificial intelligence industry, which has been hyped to the heavens in recent years, actually has thousands of fatal links to this private credit crisis. In the past few years, many private credit firms were bullish on the technology sector and generously issued huge loans to a large number of traditional software companies. However, due to the recent explosive spread and disruptive impact of AI technology, many of these legacy software companies simply cannot adapt to the new competition and are now on the verge of collapse. Once they collapse, the money from private credit will naturally be lost entirely. This is only one side of the coin. There is an even more devastating major issue, which is that the so-called AI industry itself is currently in a huge and absurd bubble. Look at Silicon Valley now. All major AI companies are essentially playing a game of hot potato. They are lending to and investing in each other to inflate valuations. Despite the fact that the vast majority of these AI companies are not profitable at all and lack real earning capacity, take the industry benchmark OpenAI as an example. Its actual revenue is actually very low, but strikingly, the debt it carries has already exceeded $1 trillion. On all of Wall Street, no one knows where OpenAI will eventually get so much real cash to repay this astronomical debt. All of this madness points to an undeniable fact. Large U.S. tech companies are in a massive bubble rare in human history. Let's look at a set of breathtaking data. The combined market value of the top 7 U.S. tech giants, often called the Magnificent Seven, including Amazon, Apple, Google, Meta, Microsoft, Nvidia, and Tesla, is actually larger than the entire stock markets of Europe, China, and anywhere else in the world combined. If you broaden your gaze and examine the entire U.S. stock market, you will find it is at the peak of the largest bubble in recorded history. Currently, the total value of all listed stocks in the U.S. has exceeded 210% of the U.S. national GDP. What does this mean? This ratio is more than double the market peak in 2007, before the 2008 financial crisis, and it is significantly larger than the peak of the famous dot-com opening (dot-com bubble) in 2000. The entire market is heading toward a cliff in a state of extreme euphoria. Do not think that the bursting of the AI bubble is just a matter of a few programmers losing their jobs. If this massive AI bubble really bursts, it will not only lead to a massive crisis on Wall Street and an epic crash of the U.S. stock market, it is also highly likely to lead directly to a Great Depression similar to that of the 1930s. Why would the consequences be so severe? Because the economic growth engine of the entire country has become completely deformed. Famous Harvard economist Jason Furman, after in-depth research, gave a shocking estimate. During the first half of 2025, as much as 90% or more of the growth in U.S. national GDP came entirely from investment in information, processing equipment and software, which to a large extent involved AI-related fields. This means that AI has essentially become the only hollow shell part of the U.S. economy that is still maintaining growth. Those large tech giants in Silicon Valley have seen their paper wealth grow so fast that it masks the truth statistically, making the U.S. economy look like it is still booming in aggregate data. But because GDP growth is just a macro aggregate number, it masks micro-level pain. In fact, as much as 80% of the U.S. population has been living under the immense pressure of an economic recession in real life, having not enjoyed any of the dividends brought by the tech stock frenzy. Therefore, once this single AI bubble, supporting the appearance of prosperity, suddenly bursts, it will drain the last bit of disguised vitality from the U.S. economy, likely leading the entire country instantly into a very, very serious and comprehensive recession. Even more tragically, this economic collapse will occur under an extremely deformed social structure currently. The top tier of wealthy people in the U.S. accounts for 50% of the total economic spending of society. Once a Great Depression arrives, the bottom layer population will lose their last buffer, which will inevitably lead to more severe and fractured wealth inequality and extreme poverty in American society. Finally, friends, if the collapse of private credit, the shattering of the AI myth, and the implosion of the historic U.S. stock market bubble weren't bad enough, I haven't even mentioned the most urgent external crisis, the devastating economic impact of the U.S.-Israeli war against Iran, mentioned at the beginning. This fire burning in the Middle East is not a local conflict. It is ruthlessly triggering the largest oil crisis shock in human history. Since energy is the lifeblood of modern industry, many world leaders are now frantically issuing high-level warnings, believing that the energy supply disruption caused by this war alone is enough to directly lead to a global recession. So, when you put all the puzzle pieces together, you find that this is indeed an out-tanned-out perfect storm that is highly likely to ignite a major global economic crisis in a short period of time. This includes the quietly imploding private credit crisis, the sky-high AI and U.S. stock market bubbles, a severe energy shortage, and the unprecedented oil shock directly caused by the war with Iran. Any one of these forces is enough to shake the market, let alone them happening simultaneously. For us ordinary people, the most direct blow will also be reflected in the supermarket bills. This perfect storm will also lead to the return of hyperinflation. Your cost of living will soar, and food prices, in particular, will certainly rise sharply. Why does war affect eating? Because modern agriculture is highly dependent on fertilizer, and a large part of the world's fertilizer, as well as the essential chemicals used to produce these fertilizers, rely heavily on exports from the Persian Gulf region. Now, due to the war there, the supply chain for these critical agricultural materials will undoubtedly be completely disrupted. You see, there are too many structural problems, too much greed, and too many bubbles, and they are now frantically influencing and accelerating each other. This is the real world we face today, and the cruel truth that big institutions and the White House are trying to cover up with flowery rhetoric. Stay vigilant and protect your own pockets, because when the storm truly arrives, only your prior awareness can save you.